Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the second part-time program, Lunch and Learn. Today's topic is on social work and self-care. And greetings to all the folks joining us via Zoom or watching the recording. So my name's Angela Willits, and I am, my pronouns are she, her. I'm a clinical associate professor in the school. I'm field faculty in mental health, and mental health is my background. And I'm also the part-time program director. So really excited to be here with you all. Before we sort of dig into this idea of self-care and, what do we think about it? How do you do it? Those kind of things. I wanted to take a quote from an article I really like called Radical Self-Care for Social Workers in the Global Climate Crisis. And this quote says, before we delve into the main topic of radical self-care for social workers, we would like to offer our gratitude to the historical and current caretakers of our planet and to Mother Earth, as our self-care is, in actuality, a re-acknowledging of connections to all the elements of care she provides us. So I like that this, before we think about self-care, that this sort of acknowledges that connection, but also I feel it at least invites me as another way to think about the land that we currently occupy as land that was stolen from the Ho-Chunk Nation, and sort of holding that in mind, that that our ability to be here today is a result of centuries of mistreatment and lies and harm done to the Ho-Chunk Nation. Okay, so first, before I talk at you about self-care, I want you to reflect for a moment on what comes to mind when I say, think about self-care. How does this concept of self-care make you feel? So just pause for a moment and, imagine when someone says, well, are you practicing self-care? Or if you're filling out a learning plan, what's your self-care plan? Like, what reactions come up for you? I can share that what comes up for me when I think about when someone says self-care, what immediately comes up for me is like, oh, I know I should be doing it. I know I should be doing more of it, better at it. I'm not doing enough of it. So for me, the emotion that most quickly comes up is like a little bit of guilt and a little feeling of obligation or even burden. Like, yes, I know it's this thing that I need to do. And I hear that from my students as well. Like, yeah, I know I'm supposed to be practicing self-care, but I just don't have any time, or I don't have the resources or the means. And then other people, when I bring up self-care in my classes, sometimes I can feel like this collective eye roll, like, here we go again. And students have challenged me around like this idea of we're just doing lip service to self-care. Like, what are we really talking about when we talk about self-care? So in constructing this talk for you today, I tried to unpack this concept a little bit from historical perspective, and just sort of the context that we exist in right now, to have us think about self-care critically first, and then, talk about what could we be doing, or what does this actually mean for us collectively and individually. So I have some problems with the concept of self-care. I think there are several issues with it, which might be surprising considering like you came to this talk about self-care and we're probably thinking I'm going to be, talking about why self-care is important and a good thing to do, which I am. But let's first criticize it a little bit, think critically about it. So some of the popular messaging about self-care are things like, if you're stressed, if you're burnt out, if you're depleted, it's because you're not practicing enough self-care. So this idea that if you just, we're better at self-care and doing it more regularly, you would buffer against being burnt out. Another idea is if you aren't practicing self-care, it's because you aren't trying hard enough. You're not dedicating the time. You could be doing more in the service of self-care. So the problem with that is, we talk in social work a lot about the person and environment lens, right? And we apply this to our clients. Let's think about our clients, the ways that they're struggling, the needs that they have that aren't being met from this person and environment lens. But let's for a moment apply this to ourselves as social workers, as people in our own environment, trying to do social work, trying to do this work. So what's this environment that we're existing in? Well, globally, we're in the midst of a climate crisis and a period of mass extinction. We're surrounded by environmental injustice where the impacts of the climate crisis are hitting vulnerable and marginalized communities in many places the hardest. And those are the communities that we aim to serve. We are in sort of this current socio-political climate where political administrations and militarized forces around the world are contributing in really large ways to humanitarian crises on every continent, nearly every continent. And then we're also in the midst of the historical context, right, of forms of social and racial injustice. We are often doing social work in the midst of these social problems and lack of access to care to meet people's basic needs. And we are routinely being asked to do more with less, right? So meet the needs of these people, but we don't actually have the stuff you need to meet those needs, but find a way to meet those needs. And then on top of it, as social workers, we are you're here in social work school learning about the values and principles and ethical standards of our profession. And then in practice, we find ourselves often in systems and agencies that are dictated by our capitalist system, right? Which is, motivated by growth and money and production. So we're trying to enact our social work values within these systems that aren't actually designed to support a lot of those. And sometimes that ultimately means that we're enacting harm as an agent of these systems. So we get into social work and we try to do this good work. And then in order to actually do what we're expected to do in our roles and in various agencies, we might walk away from the work at the end of the day feeling not good about what we did, right? Some of the time. So I don't want to get all like doom and gloom about social work, a profession that I love and that I teach about and believe in wholeheartedly. But as a way to push back on this idea of self-care as being something that if it's not happening for you, it's on you, it's your fault. I think we have to hold ourselves in the environment, in all of the midst of what we're truly in, to challenge our self-blame around why we're not good at self-care or not doing it enough. Another popular message is that you need to care for yourself so that you can care for others. In other words, you can't, run on an empty tank. You can't do your best work if you aren't taking care of yourself. And I've said this to my students for years, forever. You have to take care of yourself before you can take care of others. So I believe that. I really believe that. But the problem with this notion, and there's some gendered norms in there, is this idea of being self-sacrificing. Take care of yourself so that you can care for others. When in truth, we're all intrinsically deserving of care. So the messaging should really be, take care of yourself because you deserve to be cared for. You deserve to take care of yourself. And it's also true that we take care of others better when we care for ourselves. But the push shouldn't be take care of yourself so that you can take care of others. So pushing back on that idea that comes up with self-care a lot. And drawing from Audre Lorde, who was a Black queer feminist poet and activist, we saw, I'm sure some of you have seen the last part of this quote that's in bold there, but I wanted to give the full framework of this quote, which was written by Lorde while she was dying of cancer in her collection of essays called A Burst of Light. So she says, I had to examine in my dreams as well as in my immune function tests the devastating effects of overextension. Overextending myself is not stretching myself. I had to accept how difficult it is to monitor the difference, necessary for me as cutting down on sugar, crucial physically, psychically. Caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. So, in this quote, when we think about why we should be caring for ourselves, again, pushing back on that notion of so that we can care for others, that it truly is self-preservation, right? And so necessary if we're going to engage in activism and in social work. Okay, so another popular message that comes up with self-care is that self-care requires significant amounts of money and time. And this again has capitalistic origins, right? It's good business if you can sell the notion of self-care to people as being something that you need to spend money on. Sarah Taylor in her blog, Dissolving Margins, has the quote, self-care nowadays has been co-opted by the capitalist state and by the white wellness movement. So speaking to this idea that there are a lot of aspects of capitalism that lead us to, in a dire way, need to practice self-care. And now capitalism is remarkably profiting from this notion of self-care, right? That it's going to come in the form of a face mask or, a luxurious trip somewhere or the latest, greatest product or comfy thing that's going to really take care of you. So self-care can involve money. We can spend money on ourselves as an act of self-care, but it doesn't need to. And that's really not what self-care is about. So last things I'll say about this concept of self-care is that it's not a new concept. Social work didn't come up with it, even though we talk about it a lot in social work. It's now in the latest version of our code of ethics. They have added pieces about self-care, but we didn't create it. Native ceremonies, traditions, and beliefs connect self-care to care of the community and Mother Earth, and have been doing that for thousands of years. The Black Panther Party, for example, promoted medical self-care as a tool against white supremacy in their survival programs in the 60s and 70s. And I already mentioned Audre Lorde, was talking about self-care in 1988. So it's been around for a while. We're hearing a lot more about it now, but we didn't come up with it in social work. Another challenge of self-care as a concept is that it's not solely an individual action. So again, being a more, traditionally individualistic culture and society, there's been all sorts of messaging around self-care as being this thing that you do for yourself. It's you doing this for yourself alone, which is, comes with the term self-care. But plenty of scholars and activists like Mariame Kaba, Angela Davis, to also talk about this idea of collective care or community care. So I want to talk about collective care for a moment. So Larissa Pham, who created this vicarious trauma toolkit, says that refers to community care as all the things we need to do to support each other within systems that don't inherently support care. And so it's this idea that self-care involves collective care, because when we are engaged in and support our communities, we're actually taking care of ourselves. We're doing better by and for ourselves as well. So working for the collective good, creating positive community change, engaging in activism and organizing, engaging in mutual aid networks to provide care to others, strengthening interpersonal relationships, getting to know our neighbors, shopping at local markets. All of those we may not traditionally associate with acts of self-care, but as a part of collective care, they trickle down into how we care for ourselves as well. Okay, so I've sort of set the stage for, hey, let's think critically about the concept of self-care so that we're not just absorbing all of these problematic messages. And also invited you to think about that self-care isn't just individual, that there is a collective component to it. Now I'm going to shift in the rest of the time that we have to talk about in your practices, what might we want to think of when we think about self-care? So the first one, because we're social beings, because we do better in when we have social interaction, is building our human connections, building your community. So you'll notice on this slide, there's lots of pictures of people hugging, and pets are people, so hugging pets as well. And there's this funny thing that happens to us cognitively and emotionally when we receive a hug, or even when we think about hugging. So there's evidence that if you were to imagine giving a hug right now or receiving a hug, you actually get a little love hormone release of oxytocin. So you can actually reap the benefits of a caring hug, even just by visualizing it or imagining it, or looking at a picture of like this child hugging their dog, right? And like, oh yes, that just feels so good. And maybe it makes you think about hugging your pet. So there are benefits to just, fostering connection, right? And physical touch, which is kind of a whole other thing I could go on about, but I won't. So human connection, such an important part of our self-care practice. Another important piece is spending time in nature. So, again, Native and Indigenous cultures have known this throughout all time, that we are a part of and not separate from nature. Per usual, science and the scientific community, in more recent decades is catching up with that understanding, right? So discovering that people after surgery recover more quickly if they have a window that looks outside, if they can see the sky or if they can see green space. So we as humans, as a way to sort of refuel, center ourselves, feel loving towards ourselves, spending time in nature is like can be a direct line to do that. So I talk with my students in my field seminar about trying to get outside every day. And when you're able, going for something called an awe walk or a gratitude walk. So I'll tell you about each of those. So an awe walk is where, I suppose by yourself maybe works better because then you're not distracted if you have a friend. If you have a pet, they're right there with you. But an awe walk is when you walk around and using all your senses, just really tune into what am I seeing and what is this beauty around me and how incredible and amazing is this? So what am I smelling? What am I hearing? What am I seeing? What am I feeling? Feeling changes in temperature, feeling the ground beneath my feet, and just being in awe of what you're in, right? So, and you can do that in 5 minutes. You can take an awe walk and just connect with the power of that. A gratitude walk is very similar, but a little different. So I'll tell you how I do it. So when I go on an intentional gratitude walk, which I maybe make sure I do once a week, I try to get out every day, but like a gratitude walk maybe once a week. And as long as there's nobody around me, I will say out loud, thank you for this sky. Thank you that it's blue. I love blue. Thank you for this air. And thank you that it's clean and that it's safe for me to breathe. And thank you for the birds singing because they remind me to pay attention. Thank you for the wind because it reminds me that the universe has my back. And so all these things that I do. But so saying thank you for this flower. Thank you for this, this weed. Thank you for this dog poo that I had to step over. So that's a gratitude walk. And it can be incredibly replenishing. So spending time in nature. And here is a quote from a Navajo person who says, "It's a holistic process to love yourself and to care for yourself. As an Indigenous woman, I find that one of the ways I can de-stress and show myself love and care is to reconnect with Mother Earth." And this comes from the Center for Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute. So reconnecting with Mother Nature is an act of self-care. Another act of self-care is self-awareness. So I believe wholeheartedly that we can't be good social workers if we are not aligned and attuned to ourselves. And what I mean by that is being aware of what are my thoughts, what am I saying to myself, how am I feeling in any given moment, but also truly, and I'm not like referring to religion when I talk about spirituality, but I also believe that self-awareness involves spending time thinking about these more spiritual or sort of bigger questions, right? And how do I begin to answer those? So things like, why are we here? Why am I here? What is my purpose? Who am I? Who am I in the world? Why does this thing that I'm doing, this work that I'm doing matter, right? And matter to me, and what does it mean for me? So I think that self-awareness also involves kind of those bigger spiritual questions, in addition to being aware of our thoughts, feelings, our body at any given time. So how do we cultivate self-awareness? Mindfulness is kind of my go-to and perhaps the most effective way to build self-awareness. And mindfulness, certainly, we often hear mindful meditation. So sitting, meditating, where you aren't doing anything other than maybe focusing on your breath, or, just kind of calming the monkey mind that is constantly spinning. But mindfulness doesn't have to be meditation. You can be mindful when you're walking, mindful when you're eating. You can be mindful when you're coloring, when you're, anything. You can take in a shower, you can engage in mindfulness. So mindfulness helps increase self-awareness because it naturally means tuning into self, tuning into our interior. And Roshi Joan Halifax, who is Buddhist and spends a lot of time with other Buddhist monks, talks about in an On Being podcast episode that there's evidence that those who practice mindfulness, and she's referring to like monks who practice mindfulness, like, for thousands of hours in their lifetime, are more able to toggle between deep empathy and separation. So I want to talk about that for a moment. So our ability to experience empathy as social workers is what makes us really good at this work, right? The fact that we can be in the presence of someone and hear their story, hear what they share with us, and we can take that perspective to an extent. We can to some extent sort of feel what they might be feeling, feel what it might be like to be in their shoes. Helps us do this work, because then we can more fully connect with people and where they're at. It also, having a high capacity for empathy, makes us good at this work. It also increases our risk for burnout and secondary trauma or compassion fatigue. So it's like this double-edged sword, right? That our ability to be empathetic with people can help us do really good at this work, and it puts us at increased risk for burnout and secondary trauma. So what do we do about that? I think that being aware of, and maybe through practicing mindfulness, being aware of when I'm experiencing someone else's suffering helps us toggle back and forth more easily between that deep empathy and also knowing that there's a separation there. I'm going to skip ahead, but then I'll come back to this slide. Hang on. So something I teach my students, and it's a mantra that I developed for myself when I was doing clinical work, is the mantra of, this is not my suffering. Now, somebody could hear that out of context and think, geez, like, you don't, how can you be so uncaring? Like, but for me, I found that sitting in the presence of someone who is sharing about great suffering, maybe a trauma that they experienced, when it would start to feel really heavy for me, to where I could almost weep right along with them, it was very helpful for me to remind myself, this is not my suffering. This is not my suffering. And it would help me separate from what I was feeling as a result of my empathy. It would help me create that separation. This is not my suffering. And I would say to myself, in this moment right now, I'm not suffering. I will in my life, because we all will, right? I'll have times of suffering when it will be mine, but this is not mine. And I can create that separation. Does that make sense? I think it's really important. It really helped me being able to make that distinction. The other thing I wanted to point out on this slide, and a handout that is up there on the table, but also will be shared out when we share out this recording, is a handout called Energy Management for Care Providers. And it's just a nice little handout that talks about body awareness, grounding, visualizing, that helps remind us of tuning in, being aware, noticing where is our energy at. Do we need to ground? Do we need to create a little space, right, between us and maybe the suffering that we were in the presence of? Okay, now I'm going to talk for the rest of the time about more daily and what we might think of as micro acts of self-care. Remember how I was saying earlier, like you don't, it's a myth that you need a ton of time or a ton of money to engage in self-care. So I'm going to share some ideas of daily micro acts of self-care. But, in my experience in talking about self-care with students, sometimes it would come up like, well, none of these ideas will work for me, or, well, tell us like what you think this is supposed to look like. And, I'll let you know if that would even work for me. And so I want to acknowledge that what works for any individual is going to be different, so these are some offerings, but they're certainly not like, directions or demands, because part of what you will be working on as social work students as you navigate these years in the program and social work practice is what does work for you. How do you take care of yourself? And what works for you, what you discover, and what you already know will be different than what works for somebody else. So taking this with that in mind, there might be things here that are helpful, and there might be things that wouldn't work for you. So this is another piece that comes from the Center for Native American Youth. It's SelfLove Bingo. And I just wanted to share this because I like all the little ideas here. Things like laughing, meditating for 10 minutes, taking a break from screens for an hour, listing 10 things that you love about yourself, doing something kind. So again, these are small little acts and ideas here. Another list, and we have it in a handout here, and we'll send it out, is, this isn't the whole list, it's a couple of pages. Some simple ways to relieve some stress. And again, these are, most of them free, and many of them are brief, right? Sitting still for 1 minute can be an act of self-care. Singing a song, singing along to the radio. For me, after a tough day, choosing to put on music rather than the news is an act of self-care. And if it was a really tough day, choosing to sing along at the top of my lungs is an act of self-care, right? Having a cup of tea, or if you're a coffee drinker, having a cup of coffee, but not just like going through the motions of having that. When I have a cup of coffee, I really like for at least the first 3 drinks for me to be totally mindful of it. So sitting down, noticing the warm mug in my hand, thinking through, that I'm taking a drink, noticing the taste and the warmth as I drink it. And then I'll hop on the computer and drink the rest of the mug without even realizing that I'm drinking it. But even being mindful for the first few sips can make a really big difference. Okay, so these are just some, stroking a pet, petting a pet, can't say enough about that one, as an act of self-care. So ideas for self-care at work or at your field placement. There's a handout, 21 Ways to Reduce Stress During the Workday by Saki Santarelli. What I really like about this handout is that it starts off with from the moment you wake up and start preparing for your workday through to the time when you get home after work. And it's all sorts of little micro mindfulness practices and other things that you can do to practice self-care during the workday. So things like using your breaks to truly relax, getting out for a walk, maybe an awe walk or a gratitude walk, go with a coworker and start saying thank you to everything. Tuning into your breathing for 3 breaths. So for me, when I was doing clinical work, I would get scheduled with clients back to back. And yes, you're supposed to end at 50 minutes and then have 10 minutes to do your notes, right? And then go get your next client. That rarely worked out for me. So I was literally going back to back to back. And sometimes the only thing I could do to sort of step away from the session I just had to step into and prepare for the next session was to just sit and do 3 grounding breaths, which takes maybe 15 seconds, 30 seconds, and then get up and go get my next person. But even that is impactful and an act of self-care. Keeping reminders of your successes. So I have something called a rainy day folder, and I have an electronic copy in my email. I have an email folder, and then I have a hard folder in my office where anytime I get a nice email or I got a card from someone, anything like that, it goes in there. And then that way, if I'm having a really tough time, and I don't have to pull this out very often, but it's there, and just knowing that it's there is like this grounding reminder of, especially on the days when I'm like, should I even be doing this work? Am I any good at this? Reminding myself like, yes, you have made a difference, and you should be doing this. Attending to your office surroundings if you have an office. So really, and I would say that too for your home environment, really protecting that space so that it is nourishing to you. So whatever that means for you, maybe through the imagery that you have in the space, maybe it's comfort items like a blanket or a pillow. Maybe it's through scent in your space, maybe a particular smell, something like vanilla, or lavender, a soothing smell, but attending to your physical space and increasing your sense of comfort and soothing in that space. Another important thing to consider at work is supervision and consultation. So this goes back to what I was saying earlier about human connection and building your community. I think to be successful at work, you have to have a support community that you can turn to. And that might be in the form of your supervisor. It might be in the form of a couple of colleagues that you feel that you can be vulnerable with and really honest with. In my experience, and this comes from working with veterans, as well as going to different agencies and talking about self-care and kind of seeing the dynamics of the team at these agencies. Something that I've learned is people can be engaged in work that is incredibly difficult and incredibly painful on a regular basis. And somehow people can continue to be engaged in that work as long as, at least this is what I think and what I've noticed, if they've got a team around them that they feel sort of, we're all in this together, we're supporting one another, I'm here for you, I get it, and I've got you, people can get through really hard things, including work. really difficult aspects of work. So having a community at work, getting supervision, being able to consult and debrief and just process is so important. And then some other last ideas for self-care, and this is more to things outside of work. So first and foremost, having a meaningful life outside of work. So Audre Lorde in that quote talking about overextension, and we've seen this in more like popular memes or posts on Instagram, like your exhaustion, I can't remember what it was. Your exhaustion isn't a sign of your, I can't remember. Anyway, this idea that that it's not like a badge of honor, you know, that I'm exhausted, I'm overworking, like that doesn't necessarily mean something good, right? So having a meaningful life outside of work and rewarding that, because we are in a society and culture that doesn't necessarily reward that. You know, we get rewarded in a capitalistic society, you're rewarded for what you produce, and that's done at work, right? There isn't much value placed on rich, meaningful life outside of work, at least not as much as placed on, you know, living for your work. So having a meaningful life outside of work, can't say that enough. I think the work to home transition helps you ease and move into that. So like for me, I talked about like in the car, you know, being thoughtful about what I choose to listen to. I just want to emphasize that again, you know, at least for me, because I live about 35 minutes away from campus. When I was in the pandemic and didn't get that transition time, I really felt that, you know, like I was down in the office, working, teaching, doing whatever. And then in a matter of seconds, I can be up in my life with my family, and I didn't get any time to transition. So that transition can be really important. At work, having an end of day routine that sort of closes work for the day. And then like for me, when I would come home from work, changing my clothes into like home clothes, comfy clothes is another way to like signal to my brain of, hey, I'm done with this thing and let me step into this really meaningful life outside of work that I have and want to nurture. Another suggestion, limiting your exposure to, for social workers, work-related media. So that might be in the form of the news, could be in the form of social media, Instagram, Facebook, whatever you young ones are using these days, whatever else is cool. But also things like documentaries, movies. My husband and I got to watch like a grown-up movie last night. So we watched a crime movie on HBO with Denzel Washington, and it was super good. But before we decided to watch it, I had to talk through myself, like, are you sure you're up for this, Angela? Like, this is going to be about like people getting killed and like, you know, what if it's really horrific? Like, are you sure this is what you want to do on your Friday night? I ultimately decided that yes, I wanted to watch Denzel on my Friday night, but I had a thoughtful, you know, process of making that decision. So yeah, I'm really careful about when I click on social media at the end of the day. I know a lot of the stuff I follow on Instagram is related to like social movements and things like racial justice. And that's really important to me. It's one of the ways that I stay informed, but I also have to think through, like, is this what I want to flood myself with right before I close my eyes and try to go to sleep? So being thoughtful about our exposure to media. And just because we have access to all of the suffering going on in the world at any given moment in time, should we? And I think the answer to that is no, we should not. We're not actually designed, we're not, and Laura Dernoot-Lipsky talks about this in Trauma Stewardship, the book Trauma Stewardship, that we're not designed to sort of be aware of all of these crises and suffering going on around the world, because we have our nervous system has a response to those. But when we hear about what's going on halfway around the globe, there's very little, if anything, that we can do about it. So now we've had this emotional and nervous system response, and we're just left with it. And then what, right? So it takes a toll on us and can be really depleting. Okay, so enough on that one. Good food, nurturing the body, good sleep. Again, like, you know, in a society about sort of work, and production, sleep gets minimized. Some people, you know, even sort of pat themselves on the back for being able to function just fine with 5 hours of sleep a night. But more and more we're discovering and being reminded that we really need good sleep, that not having good sleep takes a toll on all of these other areas. Moving your body in the form of some kind of exercise that works for you, stimulating your senses. You know, the joy and essence of being alive is that we have these 5 senses to get to experience the world. So give them something to experience, right? In the form of taste, touch, smell, sight, feel. Of course, drinking enough water, you know, got to put that one in there. Practicing gratitude, either on a gratitude walk or just as a part of your meditation, gratitude journal. I started practicing this past May using a book, a daily gratitude practice, and it was like, this sounds cheesy, but it was life-changing, like practicing gratitude in the ways that this book guided me to. It was profound for me. So put a little plug in for practicing gratitude. And then restorative social interactions. There's an article, a JAMA article, study that found that having at least one person that's a good listener, someone that you can count on, that you can go to and talk things through, boosts cognitive resilience, boosts our ability to bounce back cognitively and emotionally. So having someone in your life that's a good listener, and I like this word, restorative social interactions, because I think many of us, whether it's our friends or family members or maybe colleagues, many of us interact with people in ways that maybe are helpful for the other person, but they're not necessarily replenishing or restorative for us. So we're giving, but we might not be receiving. So I invite you to be selfish with your kind, caring energy, and be choosy about who you spend time with. And, you know, as you cultivate your community, your network of friends, think carefully about, does this person feed me, maybe literally with good food, but do they feed me emotionally in the way that I hope that I'm feeding them, right? And that we're giving to each other in this way. And if it feels more one-sided, maybe stepping away from that and giving yourself permission to take space from that. Because we really need those people that, and we don't need many of them, just one, maybe 2, maybe 3, that really replenish us and restore us. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing. And that's all the slides that I have. I guess I would open it up to the folks in the room. If you have any questions or, you know, anything that you'd like us to talk more about before we wrap up. You all too, if you have questions. Anything comes to mind? No? You're like, we're on camera. We're not saying anything. Okay, well, as I said, there's some handouts here that expand on some of these things. We'll include those handouts and the links with the talk. And thank you so much for being here and taking the time. And now go practice some self-care. Get outside, weather permitting. All right, thanks everyone.